Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic effects, let's talk about the long-term effects. We're going to talk about this mostly because a lot of people who use alcohol use them for a very long time. You can be what's referred to as a functional alcoholic for a long time. And while it may not affect your ability to conduct your life, it is going to have severe health effects. So let's talk a little bit about some of those. Um, the wide range of long-term effects of alcohol is just massive. Of course, you're not responsible for memorizing all of these. I just want to use this figure to sort of represent how chronic alcohol use can have an effect on basically all of your bodily systems. And we'll talk about the liver because that's the one people are most aware of, and the pharmacokinetics of it tie in well. But a lot of different things can happen from alcohol. And here's an example of a lot of those. I think one that people don't necessarily fully realize is the reproductive system. For women, it could mean that you no longer release eggs or ovulate. You're more prone to miscarriages. For men, it can lower your sperm count. It can also result in impotence. All right. So most people are familiar with the idea that chronic alcohol use can cause liver dysfunction. This is basically because if your body, for two separate reasons. One, if your body is busy metabolizing alcohol to the extent that it cannot metabolize other things, then those products are going to build up and cause damage. That's what's happening with a fatty liver. The metabolism of fat is neglected for alcohol, right? Additionally, you can have something like alcoholic hepatitis, which is because of the metabolic products of alcohol. So it's not necessarily that something else is not being metabolized, it's that you're metabolizing alcohol so much and the byproducts of it are toxic, and that toxic buildup is going to cause damage. Alcoholic cirrhosis is scarring or loss of blood vessels to the liver, right? If you don't have blood flow, you can't have liver function. This is basically just due to general tissue damage. And vulnerability to a lot of these can be increased or decreased by the level of alcohol metabolism enzymes. For example, right, if you change your levels of enzymes to increase the levels of acetaldehyde, meaning that there's more acetaldehyde in your system, or that that alcohol metabolism stays in the stage of acetaldehyde before moving on to acetic acid longer than other people, you're more likely to develop fatty liver. So there's also changes in higher cognitive function. This is often referred to as Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. The classic sign of Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome is cell loss in the thalamus and hypothalamus. This may be due to the upregulation of NMDA receptors that can cause neurotoxicity when they're functioning normally, when alcohol is not in the system, and you have that chronic upregulation, calcium's flowing into the cell, and that can cause neurotoxicity. So the symptoms of Wernicke-Korsakoff are confusion, disorientation, tremors, poor coordination, and memory disorder. It is progressive and irreversible, so even if you stop drinking, the neurotoxicity is going to continue. It can be slowed by a thiamine treatment. Thiamine is a nutritional vitamin that you get. Oftentimes, if somebody is an alcoholic, they have very low levels of thiamine. They don't consume enough of it in their diet, and that deprivation contributes to the cell loss. It's also characterized by learning and memory impairment. So this is what this is a coronal slice. The last one is a horizontal slice from that spectrum. Sorry, doesn't really matter. Anyway, so we're looking at a control slice here of a brain, and this is sort of a zoomed out version of the structural cortical folding that we see. When you look at an alcoholic, you can see there's significant enlargement of the ventricles, which is a signature of cell loss. When brain cells die, the body usually fills the space by enlarging the ventricles and adding more CSF. You can also see down here at the hippocampus, right? This is the hippocampus. In alcoholics, it's significantly smaller. You can see those black spaces around it that are filled with CSF. Those are much smaller over here in our control brain. You can also see the loss of gray matter around the cortical folding, both here and here, right? Those larger gaps are also going to be due to that cell loss. They're long-term changes and they're permanent, so they're not going to recover from this. So alcohol is interesting because we see so many different kinds of tolerance. I think one that people don't fully understand or realize, I know I didn't, is something referred to as acute tolerance. So this is basically during the experience of drinking, and it can be any experience of drinking. You do not have to be a chronic drinker. It can be the first time you're drinking. Basically, more people report that they're intoxicated on the upward swing of their blood alcohol concentration. So as they're moving here, they'll report themselves as being intoxicated. They will say, oh, I feel drunk, right? But, and then they reach a peak, once they reach a peak level of alcohol, right? These is A, B, and C are different incidences of alcohol administration. So this is their peak BAC. And as they start to come down, remember we're metabolizing at about 0.5 ounces per an hour. So as this is called the downswing, on the downswing, even though their blood alcohol level is still at probably 0.25, which is really high, they are reporting themselves as sober, right? Here, they would have said, on the upswing, they would have said that they were intoxicated. But here on the downswing, they report themselves as sober. So it's about an acute tolerance to the behavioral effects. You habituate to the new feelings that are being brought on by intoxication, and they feel sort of normal. They don't hit you as being strange or different anymore. So you report yourself as sober. This is particularly dangerous when making decisions about driving. Right? On the upswing, you might say, no, I'm too drunk to drive. But on the downswing, which is much more likely towards the end of the night, you'll say, I feel fine, I feel sober. However, reporting that you feel sober does not mean that you are acting sober. It doesn't mean that you have normal motor function. Okay. So another kind is acute pharmacokinetic. Most pharmacokinetic tolerance to alcohol is through metabolism. This can also be referred to as drug disposition tolerism. You see an increased metabolism, right? So this is a graph showing that. So this is blood alcohol levels before the building of a tolerance, right? So you see that initial spike and you stay at a higher level for a longer period of time. After you develop the drug disposition tolerance, this metabolic tolerance, you don't even see that initial spike. You consume the alcohol and you see immediate drops. So your body just processes it a lot more quickly. You can also see pharmacodynamic tolerance. So that means that downregulation of GABA A, the downregulation of GABA A and the upregulation of NMDA. Those together are going to contribute to that imbalance between glutamate and GABA A activity. So that's an imbalance between excitation, between inhibition and excitation that shifts the brain more towards excitation when alcohol is not present. This can result in a lot of the withdrawal effects we see. And when we look at glutamate levels, when somebody is going into withdrawal, they actually follow the time course of withdrawal symptoms very closely. So this is looking at how much glutamate is being put out in picomoles per minute. And this is a study that's being done in alcohol-dependent rats. So in alcohol-dependent rats, the glutamate release is increased at around 10 hours after withdrawal. So this 0 is the last time after last alcohol. So at around 10, 12 hours, between 6 and 12, we see this massive increase in glutamate release, right? You don't see that in an animal that was chronically consuming sucrose and then stopped. You only see it with alcohol. And when you line it up to withdrawal scores reported as observed in the animals, the time course of them is very similar. You start seeing that big rise between 6 and 12. So there's a lot of evidence here that if you could mitigate that spike in glutamate levels, you might be able to decrease the severity of withdrawal symptoms. There's also behavioral tolerance. We actually talked about this way back in Unit 1, so I'm not going to get into a bunch of detail about it. But it's basically if you practice a task all the time while you're drunk, so this is not the same as acute tolerance. It's about repeated incidences of doing a behavior while intoxicated. You can actually become better at that behavior. It's not that the physiological effects are different. It's that your ability to do that behavior is better, mostly probably because your body has found some way to compensate for the effects of the alcohol. So this is an an example, this is all back from Unit 1. I'm not going to ask you any specific questions about this, but I just wanted to remind you that behavioral tolerance is occurring. So you see tolerance, you also see dependence. There's both psychological and physiological dependence. The physiological dependence is going to manifest as withdrawal symptoms. The psychological dependence is going to manifest as an addiction, right? Which we're going to talk about next. I think we're also going to talk about withdrawal effects when we talk about alcohol abuse as well, right? And that's going to be a result of that physical dependence that we see. So that is it for chronic effects. We're going to talk a little bit next about alcohol abuse.